Narmata Raju, she is in India Director, Equidem Research and Consulting. Namrata is a labor migration expert and leads Equidem's India work, also collaborating closely with the Equidem's initiative across South and Southeast Asia, East Africa, and the Arab Gulf. As a researcher for over a decade based out both South Asia and the Middle East, Namrata has worked on a number of migration and labor issues, ranging from recruitment, remittances, and the future of work to post-conflict livelihood in Sri Lanka. Namrata has been a research advisor across multiple sectors in the MENA region, including to various government departments and banking and financial institutions. She has also worked closely with the International Labour Organization, Sri Lanka office, advising on various inputs to the country's national labor migration policy. When she was fellow at Harvard University's Women and Public Policies program, and in okay. And we have also Rima Kaloush. Rima, she is working with the Migrant Rights Organization. Migrant Rights Organization as observation and monitoring the situation of migration in the MENA and also in the countries of origin. Now we will start with Narmata. Narmata, what the situation of the worker through post-migration and how their vulnerability make them sometimes victims of human trafficking.
Thanks so much, Linda, and such a pleasure and honor to be here and speak on this important topic. So, I mean, I think that perhaps I would like to start with a quote from one of the workers that Equidem spoke to about a year into the pandemic. And he says, nobody knows the extent of the mental toll this situation has put on us. There is a very real chance that many workers will resort to suicide. The government should do something for us. It's either that or they'll have to send our dead bodies back home. So this is from a construction worker in the UAE. And this was as per a report that Equidem conducted, wherein we collected data for over a year from when the pandemic commenced, covering a large amount of primary data from workers on the ground across the GCC. And essentially what we found was that workers faced a high degree of wage theft. So I think there are echoes of this as per what Igor's presentation mentioned earlier, wherein a lot of workers faced wage theft by their employers and were in extreme levels of financial distress, wherein they weren't paid their salaries for many months across multiple sectors. And on top of that, they weren't paid their gratuity. So there were workers who worked in spaces for maybe 10 years and weren't paid their gratuity. To make matters worse, workers were also dealing from recruitment fraud. And this links to Linda's question of post-migration vulnerability, because we found that workers were already in very bad states of indebtedness. And after paying very, very exorbitant recruitment fees and subsequently ending up in the country and finding that they were actually given lower pay. So there were situations of contract substitution. So all of these extremely bad circumstances during the pandemic sort of culminated in extreme financial distress, and also links back to the quote that I mentioned, wherein the worker was talking about people actually committing suicide. And of course, the financial impacts of this are vast. It's not just on an individual basis. We also saw the implications for the families of the workers back home in their countries of origin. Some of the larger problems that we've been seeing, again, relating to the context of the pandemic, is government responses in the Gulf countries to the situation, which is that a lot of the governments have focused on responding to nationals, the need of nationals, which of course is understood an industry, but despite the fact that a large drove or large droves of migrant workers comprise the workforces of some of these countries, they were actually excluded from labor protections and were left sort of destitute and without social protections. This is something that we saw. And especially of concern to us are some of the reforms that came in with respect to weakening labor protections. For example, the UAE resolution 279, which came out in March 2020, wherein it made it easier for employers to place workers on paid leave or unpaid leave, or reduce worker wages temporarily or even permanently. Now, one of the larger issues here as well is that this is supposed to be enacted as per Resolution 279 based on worker consent. But unfortunately, given the lack of worker access to trade unions and the lack of freedom of association and the various egregious restrictions placed on workers in terms of organizing, consent seems to be a facade in terms of our assessment of the situation, which continues to be the case. So essentially through the pandemic, what we saw is that workers who are in country at the moment have faced extreme situations of exploitation, and we would say, as per our assessment, that the modern day slavery conditions have definitely been exacerbated. On the subject of recruitment fraud, there are things that we have been seeing. And again, Igor mentioned how recruitment has been taking place or has been stalled and things like that. So of course, we have seen this sort of expand and contract over the course of the pandemic, because at certain points, migrant workers found themselves stranded and unable to go home. Then subsequently, they were placed on flights that they had to pay extremely high amounts of money, which they could not afford. And when they went back home, then they were locked into their home markets, unable to go back overseas. So these are the kind of problems that we saw, and interestingly have resulted in even more complex dynamics with respect to recruitment. For example, one of the things we have been seeing is that migrant workers who are currently in South Asia, so Equidem researchers have been speaking to migrant workers very regularly, and one of the trends we've been noticing is that some of the migrant workers who were unable to go back to the Gulf countries and destination states had already paid very high recruitment fees. So they had borrowed money, usually via informal means, because they don't have access to credit. And subsequently, they were never paid this fee back. So these workers are still stranded or face these problems and were unable to go back to the destination country. So again, we see that this financial indebtedness, financial distress has had such a domino effect in multiple ways in terms of the psychosocial impact on workers. Earlier, we were talking about suicides and things like recruitment fraud even being exacerbated and having different implications and complexities during the pandemic. There are some reforms that we see which I must say are welcome. For example, initiatives by the Qatari government and Saudi to relax restrictions on entry and exit of migrant workers, and perhaps make a bid towards increased worker mobility. But Equidem's estimate is that this simply does not go far enough, because some of the problems that we are talking about here are deeply systemic and structural, resulting in very severe racial discrimination against migrant workers from South Asia, from East Africa, and Southeast Asia, especially from these geographical buckets, I would say. And while it is welcome, some of the things that we continue to see are, for example, cases of absconding workers There are lots of falsified charges relating to absconsion placed on workers, and workers actually now, given the fact that they don't have any platforms, for example, with trade unions, are simply in a pickle with nowhere to turn to. And similarly, when we think of the Saudi reforms, which came about in March 2021, what we found is that they vastly exclude a large number of workers, for example, about 4 million workers who are domestic workers, farmers, gardeners, or security guards or drivers, are excluded from the ambit of such reforms, which is again a large concern to us. Something to be applauded again, though, and for us it's a step in the right direction, are some of the measures that have been taken with respect to healthcare. For example, initiatives in Qatar to actually look at ensuring workers get information in their own languages and so on and so forth during the pandemic. But again, these are extremely initial steps, because workers who have been in countries subsequent to migrating have either been locked in, so they have found themselves precipitated into various forms of forced labor or modern slavery, or very often they have been locked out and unable to go back to their destination countries. And again, all of these workers, as we know, fulfill such a crucial role in the labor market and are massively underpaid and not remunerated in line with the role that they play as a crucial cog in the larger economy. I will mention one last thing, which is that when we look at the issue of workers in general, I think that the way we can look at it is that workers, workers who were marginalized before have essentially been pushed much further to the margins. And this is something we have seen globally. For example, there are companies that continually pass down their financial impacts to workers in the form of, for example, non-payment of wages or non-payment of gratuity. And you see this, the more vulnerable a worker is when they have migrated, the worse their predicament has been. And of course, the situation has been made, it has heightened further on account of some measures by the state. And these examples can be seen with respect to gender. For example, it is no coincidence that a lot of the people who are workers who experience some kind of gender-based violence during the pandemic are women. And it is, again, no coincidence that we see all of this in, for example, the presentation that Igor just made. And it is also no coincidence that workers who are undocumented continue to face various sorts of problems, discrimination, detention, and punitive action, which are all extremely worrying trends from the region that we continue to see. And so a lot needs to be done in terms of reform. The first being that the reforms made thus far, the ones that allow for workers to be unpaid or for salaries to be reduced, all of those call into question whether anything is actually being done in terms of worker welfare. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that a lot of questions have to be placed to employers as well. There are even seemingly smaller measures that could go a long way. Examples could be just simply vetting the recruitment agent that an employer has been using for a long time. So are there recruitment agents actually engaging in recruitment fraud? Other issues could be things like allowing for the formulation of worker committees to ensure that worker voices are heard. So I will stop there. Because I know that there is a lot to discuss. But thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak on such an important topic.
Okay. Thank you very much. Also, if you have any question, you can chat us regarding to this question. Through your conversation, I remember what happened with the migrant workers in Jordan through pandemic, and especially the workers, and daily workers, especially domestic workers that live out, and the situation with their children, and how all the program left them behind. I think it's very important also to focus or to ask for social protection for all the workers, including migrant workers, because through the social protection program, they exclude the migrant workers from this program through pandemic. Very important to include social protection for the workers, in addition to wage protection and other.